This is a wonderful event, and we're all really thrilled everybody is here. I'm Newcomb Stillwell. I'm the board chair. I've been for 2 years. I think you all know our topic tonight is the history of LGBTQ politicians and campaigns. We're talking about 3 different seminal events. Gary Studd's re-election campaign in 1984, which I'm old enough to remember. After the congressional page scandal, our own Byron Rushing's early promotion of same-sex marriage, which is one of the first voices on that, and Maura Healey's recent campaign. We have a wonderfully distinguished collection of speakers. On my immediate left, Mary Robert Schneider, who's Gary Studd's first biographer and did his research here. We have Gary Studd's papers, which we're very proud of. We have Byron Rushing himself. And this may sound silly, but your name reminded me of Mount Rushmore. And I started thinking, you're sort of a veritable Mount Rushmore on your own right of modern Boston history. So, and you've been our trustee and advisor for a long time and have kindly donated to us your papers. And so it's a wonderful thing to have you here this evening. We have Samantha Gross, who's a distinguished reporter for the Boston Globe and who covers Maura Healey and the legislature and sort of politics generally in Massachusetts. And she didn't accept my question as to whether that meant she was the Howie Carr of the Globe. And Joan Ilacqua, who is the executive director of the History Project, who's sponsoring this with us this evening. One thing I wanted to mention, this event is the result of a several-year collaboration between our organizations, of which we're really proud. I think everybody knows, but the History Project has been going for quite a while and is the leading collector and preserver of LGBT historical materials in New England, and probably, if not one of the most important such institutions in the country. And we're very, very, very proud to be collaborating with you generally and on this. We've been doing it for what, 3 years, something like that? Yeah. And we're the Mass Historical Society, and I think all of you know about us, but we're the oldest historical society and have been going for 225 years and have something like 14 million documents and objects, and are widely viewed as the second, which is irritating, most important collection of American historical materials behind the National Archives. But we're a lot more fun and interesting than they are. And interestingly, I was thinking about this, talking to some of the staff, which is not something that maybe occurs to everybody, but we actually have a quite robust, and I bet if we really put the lens on it, one of the biggest and most interesting collections of LGBTQ historical materials when you think about it. I mean, our 14 million documents include bazillion letters and diaries of what we used to call confirmed bachelors and ladies in Boston marriages and all this stuff. And it's all here. And, that community had a very big influence, as we all know, in the history of New England. So we're very proud of that. And there's a lot of good work to be done in those collections. Finally, I just ought to mention one person who I think is well known to you, and to many of us here, Anna Clutterbuck Cook, who was on the staff here and was very active in different LGBTQ organizations and was instrumental in the beginnings of our collaboration. She died in January, sadly, and she would have been thrilled about this, and we're sad she's not here. But anyway, enough from me. Without further ado, our panelists. Thank you all.
I think I've been in this longer than you have. So let me, you don't mind if I go first, do you? Yeah. Okay, thank you. So my name is Byron Rushing, and I was in the legislature from 1980. I got first elected in 1982, from 1983 to 2018. Yeah, and so I lived and worked through a good deal of this history in the legislature. I was putting my notes together and realizing I might have been quoting myself too much. But I will start with a quote of mine that I recovered. Marriage is not a civil right, it is a civil institution. The civil right is the right to choose your partner in marriage. It is always appropriate for the government to set rules for civil institutions. In a democracy, all civil institutions should be open and available to all who qualify. Civil marriage should be available to all who qualify. I'm convinced that sexual orientation should not disqualify a person from choosing whom to marry, and that same sex should not disqualify a couple from civil marriage. In the legislature, yeah, I got applause when I did it the first time, right? In the legislature, I was an original sponsor of the Massachusetts gay rights law. That legislation was originally filed in the 1970s. The 1970s is when we came to understand that this was an issue that had to be dealt with in public policy. 1969 was Stonewall. 1974, Elaine Doble was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives, the first gay person elected to the Massachusetts legislature. And I, in the legislature, was an original sponsor of that law. That legislation was originally filed in the 1970s, while all of this was happening, by a Jewish legislator who was in the closet at the time, and an African-American legislator who was straight, as they used to say. They were Barney Frank and Mel King. Mel was my immediate predecessor. I came into the legislature ready to carry on this work. I filed the bill in 83, 84, and 85, 86, and 87, 88, right? Right after I filed the first time, I got calls from both Barney and Mel complimenting me on the fact that it got out of committee, right? And that's as far as it had gotten. And it passed in 1989. In none of those debates did we mention marriage. Most of the gay and lesbian people who lobbied for that legislation did not say they were gay or lesbian. They were all in the closet. Right? I have been in many conversations about this. And as you know, in the United States, it is state governments which set the rules for qualifications to enter civil marriage. And those rules have never been uniform across the land. You can marry your first cousin where? In half the states of the Union, right? And for at the time that this was being discussed, the issue, the model that we had in front of us had nothing to do with gay people. It had to do with Black people. Until the debates on same-sex marriage, the most public debate about marriage, it was about two things. One was divorce. Some of you might remember that, right? And the other was about race, interracial marriages, miscegenation, as it was called. And the Supreme Court, California Supreme Court, Pat was the first court to deal with this issue, and they ruled it unconstitutional in California. And almost all the states in the South immediately put the ban on same-sex marriage, on interracial marriage in their constitutions. And that's where the idea came from, to put this in state constitutions. When the United States Supreme Court ruled in Loving v. Virginia in June 1967 that this was unconstitutional, 16 states had so-called anti-miscegenation laws on the books. The Virginia court judge, who was overruled by the Supreme Court, wrote in his decision, "If God has meant for whites and blacks to mix, we would not have been placed on different continents." That was in 1960. That's the 1960s. The story of the plaintiffs, the Lovings, is a wonderful story, and you should. I encourage you to read it. Their histories. After the Goodrich decision in Massachusetts in 2003, the same attitude existed in the state, and some legislators proposed an amendment to the state constitution to prevent the civil institution of marriage from being open to same-sex couples. Marriage is not mentioned in our state constitution. In Massachusetts, the legislature is obliged to determine whether it is expedient to alter the Constitution. And it is only after that question is answered positively in 2 joint sessions that we ask the people if they agree. So the whole issue here was not to get this issue to be a referendum in this state, because we knew we would lose. And that was the strategy and the work that was done for the next literally 3 years. 2, because we had to have these votes in 2 sessions. The idea that people automatically get to vote on any proposed amendment to our state constitution is just not in the amendment process of the state constitution. In May 17th, 2004, same-sex civil marriage was permitted in Massachusetts, permitted because of our state judicial court. And the final effort to amend the state constitution forbid same-sex marriage was defeated by the state legislature in June 14th, 2007, by the necessary supermajority of 75% of the legislature. That's a huge number. And this happened because of an incredible amount of organizing and lobbying by not only gay and lesbian people, but also by progressives in the state. It is probably one of the most successful progressive movements that Massachusetts has ever successfully engaged in. We can start talking about why that happened, but part of it was that the Supreme Judicial Court said that it would happen, and so people could get married. And let me tell you, in and of itself, that was incredible lobbying. So you find out, because you get a wedding invitation, that you have a gay couple living on your block. So what do you do? What do you do? And so I'm going to blame it on the husband. The husband says, we are not going to that, right? And then after a few days, he said, but I think we better send a gift. And that was the major shift that allowed us to keep this from being part of the Constitution. We have had several successes around civil rights since then. The most important since then, of course, was civil rights guaranteed for transgender people. That was in itself very difficult. When this whole thing started in the 1980s, even gay people didn't mention them. Gay people get discriminated against transgender people in this state. And it took them a while to get to the point where they would support them and their rights. So it took until 2016 for that civil rights bill to be passed. I have a lot more to say, which I will say in the questions and answers. Ask me anything. But in that same year, a remarkable thing happened. It was a surprise for a lot of people, mostly people of color. It was a shock for white people. And that was the election of Donald Trump in November of 2016. We will talk about what all of that means and what all of that means for the current backlash that is going on right now as we continue. Thank you.
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm Samantha Gross. I cover politics at the Boston Globe. Most recently, I covered the campaign and election of Maura Healey, who's the first lesbian governor in Massachusetts and was the first lesbian governor to be sworn in the country. I also cover the legislature, and I cover a lot of these issues kind of as they come up. But I'm here today to talk about Maura Healey and kind of what she means for the state and how she made history here and also just across the country. She is one of the most recent, but certainly not the first politician here to break barriers in Massachusetts on LGBTQ history. In 2014, when she won her election to be Massachusetts Attorney General, she was the first gay out Attorney General in the country. And that was a really big deal. And people kind of in her office joked that she was the gay G, and that she was going to turn things around and be a big advocate. And it was kind of a joke, but she really was. And yeah, I've been covering her for, a few months or, kind of leading up to the election. And one of the things I really noticed about her is that whenever people would ask her about like what it means to you, that you could very well be the first out gay governor in Massachusetts, first lesbian governor in the country. She kind of always said, it's just a fact about me. It's just who I am. And I think some people were like, well, yeah, but say more about, your experiences. But it really is just crucial representation, and definitely saw a lot of that on the campaign trail. The first time I interviewed her, I wrote a profile about her identity and about what it, will mean for people in the state right before the election. And she said, for me, you naturally recognize people who aren't in the majority, people who may be victimized, people who may be discriminated against. And I bring a sensitivity to that. And I think that is like the lived experience that she brings to the office. And it's been interesting to see kind of how that's played out since she took office earlier this year. On the campaign trail, I saw parents pulling their kids out of school to come meet her, saying that it was really important to have the representation. I saw kids up late, like 11 p.m. on inauguration night at her party at TD Garden, talking about, how important it was to see some big superstars there that night, the governor and also Brandi Carlile, who's performing. But, ever since she, her background is a civil rights lawyer, right? So she's always kind of taken this approach to her work. As Attorney General, she used her bully pulpit to speak out against legislation targeting LGBTQ people in other states, federal rollbacks of, health protections of certain folks in healthcare during the Trump administration. She opposed Trump administration policies that targeted transgender people. And But, you know, back before she was even Attorney General, as a civil rights lawyer within the Attorney General's office, she led the first challenge to the Defense of Marriage Act, which is the federal law that denies certain rights to same-sex couples. And after that, other states that filed their own legal challenges, and the Supreme Court overturned the law in 2013. And that really put Maura Healey on the map. So yeah, has a long history here. She, you know, went to Northeastern for law school because she knew it was a haven for LGBTQ law students to be themselves. And yeah, as I mentioned, when she eventually landed in the Attorney General's office, she really took that approach and made those issues important. But yeah, you know, she doesn't talk about her coming out story a ton. I interviewed her about it once. And I think it's a story that a lot of people can relate to, coming out a little bit later. In her 20s, you know, she went to Austria to play basketball and kind of came home and saw a lot more about herself, you know, after having seen the world. She was working at the Hampton Beach Casino and saw people like Indigo Girls and Melissa Etheridge and Ani DeFranco perform, and saw herself in the crowds of concert goers. And I don't know, when she tells that story, I think some people can, you know, find some kinship with those stories. So, but yeah, I don't have a super long presentation, but, you know, I just think the main takeaway I've taken from covering Governor Healey is it is just a fact about her, but that identity, you know, I think really inspires people in the state and young people as well. And it's something that she talks about a lot. So I look forward to answering your questions about our governor. And yeah, thanks all for being here.
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking the Massachusetts Historical Society for organizing this event, and Glavin Keespees in particular for having us all here. And thank you all for coming. As Duke Ellington used to say, without you, there's no music. I wrote a biography of Gary Studs, who was the first out congressman, and he first ran for office in 1970 when he was 33 years old. At that time, he was a midlife graduate student at the Harvard Education School. He'd grown up in Cohasset, attended Groton and Yale, and then he worked in the State Department, after which he taught at St. Paul's School. He was forced out of both positions. Yet, never having been elected to anything, but outraged by the war in Vietnam, he decided to run for Congress in the reliably Republican then 12th District of the South Shore Cape Cod in New Bedford, a district in which he had never lived as an adult, and he didn't really know where most of the towns were in the district. There were older, more experienced candidates in the Democratic primary. Nobody gave Gary Studs a chance. He was running against an incumbent who was the first person that Studs had ever voted for. Oh, and did I mention that he was a closeted gay man who listed his address as his parents' house? In my biography, I concluded of all of the quixotic quests for office in American history, this campaign was the most likely to fail. Studs proved to be an outstanding public speaker and an energetic campaigner, and he won the nomination and almost won the general election. The big issue for him was Vietnam. He immediately announced that he was going to run again, and he did, and in 1972, he was elected. Over the next decade, he fought to protect the marine environment and the interests of the New Bedford fishermen by successfully fighting for the 200-mile limit that kept factory fishing trawlers out of American waters from other countries. He became a leading opponent of American support for the Contras in Nicaragua and the Salvadoran military. But during his first decade in Congress, he stayed completely in the closet. and did not even attend the 1979 March on Washington. He kind of changed his jogging route so he could see it, but he didn't attend it. He was deeply closeted, as were almost all gay people of his generation. Not obviously after Stonewall, from 69 to 79, there was a huge explosion of people coming out, celebration of gay life. There were gains made during the 70s, but Studs was of that generation, and he was already a public figure and a kind of really buttoned down guy. He was a real, raised as a New England wasp, and it affected his behavior. Now, in 1970, when Studs first ran for office, right after Stonewall, in most states, male same-sex love making was illegal. Socially, gay people were universally condemned, bullied, and ridiculed. Ministers quoted chapter and verse to assert that sodomy was a sin that led straight to hell. Psychiatrists still regarded homosexuality as a perversion that had to be treated medically. No law protected you from being fired or evicted. Gays were explicitly banned as potentially subversive from serving in the military or for holding federal and state jobs, and there were no openly gay elected officials or even public figures in 1970. Elaine Noble was the first to be elected. I'm old enough to remember I graduated from high school in 1965 with 750 other young people, and apparently not one of them was gay. So, probably if you took that same poll in Saudi Arabia, you'd get the same answer too. But today, 17% of young people identify as being LGBTQ, kind of a remarkable figure. All right, so that kind of explains the context in which Studs decided to stay in the closet. I asked many of his campaign staffers if they ever considered that he might be gay, and they mostly replied with some version of it crossed my mind, but it was too crazy to think that it could be true, so I never mentioned it. Having arrived in Washington, though, where he was oddly more invisible than he had been while he was campaigning, Studs began to tentatively attempt to establish a gay life, and he began on a really wrong foot. He invited 3 congressional pages separately back to his apartment, and suggested that they might be intimate. 2 of them said no, and he sent them home in a taxi. A third one said yes, and later Studs took that young man with him to Portugal as his driver in 1973. And when they returned home, that young man said, I enjoyed the trip, but I don't think we should see each other anymore. And that was the end of it. And they both moved on. Then 10 years later, Studs still deeply in the closet, 2 congressional pages complained on television in shadow, saying that they had been homosexually harassed. The Congress then decided to investigate whether these charges were true. Congress had had a series of odd heterosexual sex scandals that seemed ludicrous to, very embarrassing to the people involved with them. And there was the background to it. There was Wayne Hayes and somebody else who were involved with strippers and whatever. So the ethics committee investigated the charges, and they found that they were baseless, that none of this had happened. However, in the course of the investigation, they did find that a sitting Republican married congressman, a Republican from Illinois, was then having an affair with a 17-year-old young woman. They felt, now it's a little hard to exactly pin this down, and I tried to show this from every angle in the book and be fair to all people on all sides. They then heard rumors that there was another such incident. It probably seemed to the lead investigator, Califano, that if a Democratic Congress found one Republican, it wouldn't look good. So they kept looking, and they ultimately dug up Studs case. They called the page in to testify. He made no complaints about Studs, said that the whole thing had been voluntary. It was 10 years in the past. The Congress, though, voted. The Ethics Committee proposed to reprimand Studs. Studs then, in advance of the House vote, made a defiant speech on the House floor exactly 40 years ago. He kept referring to his friends. He said, it's going to be on Bastille Day. And I wasn't sure, what did he mean by that? My first thought was he meant that the press was going to come and cut his, figurative head off, and that's what Bastille Day was. But actually, as I began to talk to his aides, they said, no. What he meant was, I'm going to be free. I'm a prisoner in the Bastille, and I'm going to let myself out. And so he made a speech saying that he had made a mistaken judgment and that his private life was none of anybody's business. Nonetheless, the House voted. So at that point, the recommendation was for reprimand, and a backbencher who nobody had heard of called Newt Gingrich got up and proposed that they change it to expulsion. And expulsion then made the middle possibility, censure, more reasonable, and the House voted overwhelmingly to censor both of the congressmen. Studs now had to make a big decision. Many of the newspapers argued that he should resign immediately. Some others said that he should not resign, but that he should not run. Nobody said in print he should run for office again. And Studs decided to do it. I think that was a very brave decision. So what he did was, if you go outside and see Peter Drummey put out a display out there, and you can see the article from that campaign in which, there was a big crowd holding signs denouncing homos. Okay, there was no bones about it. These were homophobes. So he had to put up with quite a lot, and he knew he was going to let himself in for this. I remember myself, I don't know, Byron, I'm sure you remember this, but I remember thinking this guy will never get elected again. He ran what happened was, in the Democratic primary, the sheriff of Plymouth County ran against him with only one issue. This guy, the Democratic Party was then divided, with the social conservatives on one side, Ed King, who had been a Democrat and I think was then on one side, and Dukakis was the other wing of this. That guy ran against Studs. Now, there was one really interesting incident that transpired during the course of the campaign that nobody knew about until my book came out, which was that the page in question then came back, now a 27 or 28-year-old man, came back and volunteered on Studs' campaign, and he was his driver. So the Democratic opponent, Ed Flynn, big burly guy with, traditional, quote, family values kind of guy, at a debate in New Bedford, the two of them approached each other, and Flynn karate chopped Studs and said, "I'm going to get you tonight." And the driver, who was the person in question, then shoved Flynn against the wall, and Flynn, kind of backed off. At the debate, Flynn opened with the first question at that debate was about the federal deficit that Republicans usually create in the Reagan administration. And Flynn said, "I'm not even talking about that. I want to talk about the bad behavior of Gary Studs." And everybody erupted in boos. Flynn lost the election bad. And then in the Republican primary, Studs ran against a much more dignified man who, by weird chance, was a childhood friend who never mentioned it. And he won the election. So Studs became the first openly gay person to win an election for Congress. Now, politics in Massachusetts, it's about what politicians do, but it's also about the way voters vote and behave. And to me, it's a real testament to the history of the state that mostly New Bedford working class fishermen were the ones who carried the election for Studs. So now that he was in Congress, Studs took up, the main issue that he took up was the issue of gays in the military. The Pentagon had commissioned a report that they assumed was going to show that gay people couldn't serve in the military, that they were incapable of military service. The report showed the opposite. So they buried the report and it was unknown. Studs found out about this, dug it up, and then published it. And it was an important step on the long road to the end of the ban on gay people in the military. 1993, he made a stirring address at the March on Washington on the subject that was quite powerful. Now, Studs left Congress in 1997 after the Republicans won the majority and disbanded his committee, Merchant Marine and Fisheries. He lived long enough to marry, but he died in 2006, 4 years before the next generation of activists overturned the ban on gays in the military in the lame duck session of 2010, when Obama was president. He did, however, live long enough to experience the world historic near collapse of anti-LGBTQ prejudice in the United States and many other countries. That these historic victories are under attack today would not have surprised him. He was a student and teacher of history. He followed the African American civil rights movement closely. He was at the March on Washington and on the Selma to Montgomery march as well. And he knew that there would be setbacks in every struggle for human rights. But he also understood, as W.E.B. Du Bois once said, that the arc of history bends towards justice. Defenders of human dignity can take heart from this inspiring story.
So I want to say, first of all, thank you all so much for being here, for being part of this panel, for sharing your stories and your research. And I think it's especially special that this is happening during Pride Month, which is when we celebrate and remember the Stonewall riots, but also reflect on all of the work there is still to do to support the LGBTQ+ community. And I also want to say thank you, Mass Historical, for having us here in this very historic and important space and letting us bring some queer history into this building. There's queer history here in the collections as well, but we can talk about that later. So I have a few questions for the panel, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions as well as folks online too. So I'll do some microphone running in a moment. But first, I think I've been thinking, Samantha, about what you said, that Governor Healey is quoted as saying, her sexuality is just a fact about me. And I'm kind of curious in all three of your opinions, really, when did you see this change from an essential part of who someone is when they're running for office to, it's just part about, I'm just a lesbian, no big deal. Especially when we're talking about Studs, who was closeted, Frank, who was closeted, Elaine Noble, who didn't last very long in the grand scheme of things, who made history, don't get me wrong. And in a state where we did pass a gay rights bill, but it almost took 20 years. So when was that moment, do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I think that Governor Healey, on all of her campaigns for Attorney General, for governor, has really tried to focus on the issues as kind of a civil rights lawyer. So it's interesting because she doesn't talk about her identity a lot. But I do think that her kind of coming back to the US after playing basketball abroad, coming out to her close friends, and and then deciding to like pursue law is kind of, where that shift happened, where she decided like this was something that was about, it's just something about me. And like, I want to, help all types of people who have faced discrimination. But yeah, I mean, I think she still like, talks about her identity, especially now during Pride Month. Like she marched in the parade and she went to Club Cafe and enjoyed, a night afterwards. And she's been at a lot of different like flag raisings and things like that. And I think she's really proud to be, the first gay governor here in the country. But yeah, I think like, kind of carving out her career path, she decided that that's just something about her and that, that's going to kind of color how she carried herself as a lawyer and then, eventually as a governor.
I think it's important that she made these statements before there were rumors, right?
Yeah.
Right. And I think she understood that she needed to get in front of this immediately once she decided that she was going to run for Attorney General.
Yeah. And to kind of build off of that, I mean, she has always been very private about her relationships and about her partners. But like this year, she's governor, she's like as in the spotlight as you can be. And she did, give an interview to the Globe about her partner, Joanna Lidgate, invited the Globe into her home to photograph them together. I think that was like a really big shift too, to just to be out there and to be out. And I think a lot of people, were really inspired by that.
Thank you. Byron or Mark, any?
Oh, well, I would just point out that today there are 13 gays and lesbians in Congress, and I think one in the Senate, Tammy Baldwin, might be somebody else. And I don't think anybody ever thinks about who's gay anymore. I mean, it's just, there's been a deep shift from an historian's point of view, very short time, in a long, pretty much as long as, I mean, it really is in the Bible that you're not supposed to be, it's a deep transformation and it happened pretty fast. And that's the reason that I'm not too surprised that the people who don't like this are finally getting their act together and trying to reestablish the world as it was when they were born 70 years ago.
Yeah, I think right now, the last fact I heard was there are 400 plus laws being debated in state legislatures across the country that are anti-LGBTQ right now. And those range from, book bans and inclusive curricula to limiting the access to healthcare for transgender people. It's really an awful and unprecedented wave, but we know that progress isn't a straight line. And we're kind of living in that backlash moment right now. Byron, I was curious. I think a lot of times, at least when I talk about gay history, we talk about Mel King's activism and activation of the LGBTQ community for his mayoral run or for one of them. And do you ever see, queer politicians who are working on intersectional issues, sometimes the other direction? Is there anyone you'd want to highlight beyond yourself?
I think pretty much. It was very unusual to find progressives who were opposed to doing this work. There were a lot who didn't want to be the first person out there doing it, but they were certainly there to support this work. There was an attempt by conservatives in the Black community to take a position against marriage. Many of those were Black ministers, and I, always made a point to speak to that. And then, of course, then Duvall who had no problem with this, decides to run. And I can remember I was in Franklin Park, and one of the leading Black ministers who was opposed to this came up to me and said, "All is forgiven. We're supporting Duvall." Right?
Yeah, and I think Duvall may have been the first or the second sitting governor to march in a pride parade
Right.
in 2008 when after his daughter came out. So, and I have, I think, one more question, and that's really, where do you see this movement going? Can you comment on, kind of what's happening right now? I think it's hard with Jerry living through things like Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and then not seeing it being repealed. And then we have this moment right now. Could you comment on what you think about that? Where's the work that still needs to be done?
I think one of the pieces of this politics, all politics, moving to recognizing everybody and as human beings, is that we make only one mistake, and that is we assume that when we win, that the people who lost forget. The people who lost are not converted, and they will wait for their time. And in this country, they got that time. And so we have to see our organizing, on one hand, denouncing what's happening, but on the other hand, we have to be realistic enough to understand we should not have been surprised. Yeah. And we'll win. Don't worry about it. if we do all the organizing that we've always done, you see, we can't stop the organizing that got us to the successes, right? We have to spend the same energy going forward.
Yeah, I would add to that my observation is that a lot of social change is generational. That structures that are put in place by one generation collapse as that generation leaves the scene. If those structures collapse if they're on a weak, inhuman foundation. How long these things take, historians are famous for saying, don't ask me about the future. I only know the past and not much of that. But, look, my guess is that over time, I agree with Byron, over time, the shape of the rising generation, which is growing up in a context in which everybody knows somebody who's LGBTQ plus, like my generation, nobody knew anybody who was LGBTQ plus. And that was Stutz's argument. His confidence was rooted in that gradually, as people realized that they knew somebody who was being injured by laws and prejudice, that the laws would ultimately be changed to come around to change that. I don't think Stutz saw the change, the 2010, but he was 69 years old when he died in 2006. And I doubt that he foresaw the Don't Ask, Don't Tell falling within 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Could I ask why you think it happened so quickly?
For our friends online, if you could
Yeah.
read that, yes.
Could I ask why historically you think there was this acceleration, why it happened so quickly?
What is the it?
Well, the transformation, the fact that gays were first Clinton said don't ask, don't tell, but then it became law that gays could serve in the military, and all that happened far faster than has really ever happened in our kind of culture. I grew up in Britain in the 1950s, where at a time when homosexuality was really, absolutely beyond the pale, and we were still in Oscar Wilde land, and yet at the end of the century, this all seemed to, tumble The walls came tumbling down. Why? I'm just interested in whether you have a historical.
It's the Black Civil Rights Movement. It's the only way you can explain it.
Yeah.
And so you had people being engaged in a way where they were murdered to do for these rights, and that absolutely influences everybody else who believes that they need to have rights guaranteed. And of course, for the civil rights movement, a whole bunch of those white people were gay, and so they knew it, they saw it happening, they were engaged in it. Yeah, I think it's absolutely that, the civil rights movement, because civil rights movement essentially transformed America, right? And again, the same reaction. You have the reaction against it, right? But it did give all people who felt oppressed in this country, all people who felt oppressed in this country, a feeling that it could be accomplished for them, right? We haven't gotten there yet. White people in this country still don't like Black people, right? The majority of white people in this country wake up every morning and do not see another Black person until they get to work, right? And so then how do you gain your rights in that kind of situation? And you do. And then anyone else who feels that kind of oppression, right? Don't get me on poor people, right? Anybody who feels that kind of oppression understands that they can organize and there's a possibility for success.
Yeah, I agree with Byron, and I would add it was the wider radicalization of the 1960s that began with the African American civil rights movement that exploded between 1955 and 1965. And then there was the anti-war movement, the women's liberation movement. And I think that was the context in which what was then called the gay liberation movement arose, because there were gay people in all of these movements, and they could see the power of mass action and that there was rapid social change taking place. Now, we all have to remember, looking around the crowd, I kind of sense that a lot of us lived through this. And, when a change is taking place, when you look back at it, it seems like fairly rapid, which I think it was as a historian. But when you're living through it, it feels like it's never going to end. And but my own personal take on this was, I never thought this prejudice would go away. I thought of all of the things that changed. These were deep changes in American life, a real revolution in the 60s, in the change in the status of African Americans, change in the status of women, and the end of pro-war sentiment of any type, really. It kind of started to really fade away. This one, I thought, it's too deeply rooted in the human psyche. But I was, as my friends know, I'm a pretty optimistic guy. And this exceeded expectations. And again, as we've said before, I'm not surprised that there are, I think it's 500 and something bills, in these state legislatures. They're all going to pass. A lot of them, 75 of them passed. They're going to be on the books for a while. Charles Blow had a terrific column in the Times saying, it kind of feels like we're at the beginning of the Jim Queer era. Who knows how long these laws will stay there, but over time, this is going to change too.
Yeah, we're talking about Anthony Comstock again in 2023, who was an anti-obscenity activist in the 1870s, I believe. So, it's coming back around again. I would say, from an archivist and historian note, if you go look at the digitized copies of Gay Community News that Northeastern has put online, you can watch this debate unfold in the letters to the editor in each issue over time, because they didn't just cover gay issues, they covered everything. related to liberation. And it really was an intersectional, I think, look at how many people were intertwined with all of these different movements. Yes.
I was curious, how old were the pages that Gary Studs was involved with, and did they work in his office?
No. So that's an important point about this. Congressional pages work for the Congress as a whole. No page works for a congressperson. So in a sense, a congressperson and a page are workers in the same institution, but they work in different departments. So Congress people can't hire, they don't hire and fire pages. I will say, by the way, now that you're facing this particular question, that in my assessment of this is I think what Studs did was wrong. I think he came to the same conclusion that it was wrong. Every one of these interactions a little bit different. This was one of these cases where really nobody got hurt in this case.
How old were they?
That young man was 17 years old when Studs was then 37. No, older. Yeah. I forget. He was mid-30s. It took him to Portugal. Yeah, I hope I answered that question.
Times have really evolved.
I'm sorry?
The times have really evolved since then.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking in
Yeah.
my job, if I had any sort of sexual interaction with someone who reports to me, I'd be terminated.
That's right. Yes.
And oh my God, on a 17-year-old,
Yes.
I'd have been a pedophile list.
Yes.
I hate to say it was a different time, but you're seeing that kind of reckoning now, especially post Me Too. So, yeah. Are there any questions from the folks online? No, they're just loving it. Okay, good. It looks like we have about 3 minutes left if anyone has a final question. All right, I'm going to give you back these 3 minutes. So I guess I will close this out by just saying thank you so much for being here on a beautiful day in Boston, for choosing to be here with us. Happy Pride to everyone, and come back in 2 weeks for our next presentation, which picks up really where we left off. We'll be hearing from Arlene Isaacson, a lobbyist in the State House and co-chair of what is now the LGBTQ plus political caucus in Massachusetts, from Trey Andre Valentine of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition, and Tanya Neslucin, who is the executive director of Mass Equality. Any other plugs, Mass Historical? Nope.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you all so much.